Hello, and welcome to my presentation on narrative research designs. In his 2015 text, Creswell explains that narrative research is when researchers describe the lives of individuals, collect and tell stories about people's lives, and write narratives of individual experiences. It is explained as being qualitative and as a viable way to study teachers, students, and educators in educational settings. It's interesting to note that the methods continue to develop and that as a result of narrative research having been used by several disciplines, there has been little agreement about form. That is until 1990 when Clandidin and Connolly came up with some descriptors and features of narrative research that have been accepted. Now, trends continue to influence the development of narrative research, and this includes increased emphasis on teacher reflection, increased emphasis on teacher knowledge, and increased emphasis on bringing teachers' voices to the forefront. And it's really the idea of empowering teachers and this idea of teacher reflection that is at the heart of narrative research. Now, before I continue with my presentation, I just want to draw your attention to this Popplet that I've created. And what it is it's a concrete example of a concept map for narrative research design. I'll come back to this again at the end of my presentation, and just want to inform you that I will attach it to the presentation for quick reference in the future. Now, in terms of theory for narrative research, it really focuses on asking questions about and looks for deep understandings of particular aspects of life experiences. And so it's important to recognize that the focus on the experience draws on the philosophical thoughts of John Dewey, who saw that individual experience was a central lens for understanding a person. And the theory is that people relate to one another through story, and that story is an important medium for understanding the world and our place within the world. It's also important in that telling stories is a natural part of life, and that through close relationships between researcher and participants are able to share their experiences in their own setting, therefore making them feel that their stories are important and that they are heard. An example of this is at the end of the chapter, the study that's provided as an example of narrative research shows that the researcher in that case, whereby she followed a immigrant student, she did so for 2 years, creating a close bond between herself and the student. In terms of research purposes, besides understanding that sharing stories is important and that personal experiences are offered in the actual settings that they occur, and that normal everyday data is captured, is the concept of the processes. And so research studies a single person, the data is in the form of stories, it reports individual experiences, and it discusses the meaning of those experiences for the individual. And this leads us to the next idea, which is data collection and analysis. And Creswell states that stories constitute the data. And so when conducting research, you have to consider 7 steps. Now, steps 1 and 7 are very similar to other types of research. However, steps 3, 4, 5, and 6 in narrative research are quite distinct. They include collecting stories, restoring and retelling the individual story, collaborating quite heavily, and then rewriting a new narrative. In terms of data collection, it involves drawing portraits of individuals and documenting their voices and their visions within a social and cultural context. And so data is gathered through interviews, reflections, letters, And very interesting, especially in light of today's society, is collecting data through photos and mementos and memorabilia. Before engaging in this type of research, the researcher has to consider what type of narrative study he or she would like to conduct. And in doing so, has to consider who's going to write or record the story, how much is going to be written or recorded, who will provide the story. Will it be a teacher? Will it be a student? Will it be parent? Is a theoretical lens being used? And can narrative forms be combined? In which case, Creswell says yes, they can. Creswell also provides a figure which gives examples of types of narrative research forms. And there are several there that can be chosen. The analysis in narrative research is done through restoring, and so stories are gathered, they're analyzed for key elements, and they're rewritten for sequencing. And so data analysis occurs when for example, an interview is conducted, and then the story is transcribed, and then through retranscribing the story, there are key elements that are taken out, such as setting, character, and plot development. And then coding for emerging themes occurs. And then the narrative is rewritten into another narrative for presentation purposes. And this brings us to reporting and evaluating. And so it reports on lived experiences, organizes stories into a chronological form, not always, but usually, situates stories within a setting or a context, derives themes from the stories, and demonstrates collaboration. And from a literary perspective, it's restoring that is quite interesting. And so as an English teacher, I find the organization quite interesting in that it's done very similar. It can be done very similar to the way that I would teach my students how to analyze a story. And so setting and characters are looked at. And then the development or the plot development is considered alongside a plot diagram, whereby there is movement where the character experiences some form of conflict, there's some rising action, there's a crisis of sorts, and then a conflict resolution. Another way of considering this is through three-dimensional space narrative structure, whereby there's a continuity that's looked at in terms of past, present, future, as well as character interactions and the context. Coding occurs in that themes are segmented, and there are approximately 5 to 7 themes that are presented after the restoring occurs. Context is very important, and it can be told before or it can be interwoven into the story. However, there is a great amount of detail that is provided. Collaboration is also very important, where there's active involvement of the participant throughout the process. And this brings us to the next idea of validating the information. And that again is done through collaboration and member checking specifically. There can also be triangulation among the data sources, and the researcher can search for disconfirming evidence. It's interesting that Creswell provides a very detailed table of high and low quality indicators in a narrative study. And if this is a type of research that you would like to conduct, it's worth taking note of the table that he provides on page 518. Also important to narrative research because of the first person perspective are criticisms. And so it's important for the researcher to consider whether or not the story is authentic. It's also very important for the researcher to consider whether the story is the real story. And so it could be that the story is somewhat distorted because of memory, or that details could be too horrific or raw for the participant to provide any detail about. Ownership is also another important aspect of narrative research that has to be considered, whereby because of the process of restoring, it's very important that the researcher maintains participant voice, that they avoid gains at the expense of the participant, and avoids negative implications, and so really ensures that harm reduction occurs. Again, I'll remind you of the Popplet that I created, and I hope that this presentation has helped you a little bit more in understanding narrative research.